Hello and welcome to Archive West Texas. I'm your host, Gordon Wilkerson. This program is dedicated to preserving and sharing the stories of individuals who shaped our region. Today, we're honored to visit with one of the most recognizable voices in West Texas broadcasting history, Paul R. Beane. Paul, welcome to Archive West Texas. It's an honor to have you with us this morning.
Well, it's great to be here, Gordon.
We're looking forward to the conversation. Tell our listeners about your family of origin, where you grew up.
Well, it's an interesting story, and a lot of people claim that it just couldn't be true because it sounds like it's made up. But I was born in a village called Stumptoe.
Okay.
That's the truth. Stumptoe was in Hunt County along the banks of the Beane River. And I was born, well, let me put it this way, on February 17th, way before Pearl Harbor. So that puts me at about 87, in that range. So
you're a spry 87, I'll say that.
Right. Well, I'm 87. I don't know about the spry part. But I was born and raised on a 37-acre sharecropper blackland farm along the banks of the Beane River. When I was about 8 years old, I, along with my family, moved into the town of Greenville. And that move was made possible by the fact that the bank decided that we shouldn't farm anymore, if you get my drift.
I understand that.
So anyway, and from there, I actually attended a one-room schoolhouse called the Sabine School No. 9, but it was more commonly called the Stumptoe School. It was taught by my aunt. And we had all 12 grades in one room. Now, in a lot of the classifications, we didn't have a student. We only had about 13 kids in the whole school. And my first year at Stumptoe School, we graduated one person. And he became an outstanding student from Stumptoe. He was our number one graduate for years until he ran afoul of the Texas Rangers and did 10 to 20 down at the big house in Huntsville.
Okay.
True story.
I believe it.
True
Tell
story.
us about your mom and dad, what you learned from them.
My mom and dad, high school graduates there at a little country school called Tidwell, married right after high school. My dad was a farmer, and he never owned 1 inch of land. He was always, unfortunately, a sharecropper. And they would consistently catch the worst luck in farming that was possible. I remember in 1946, 1947, and 1948, on 37 acres of blackland cotton, we made 3 bales of cotton. And you can't hang on to that. You got to do something else.
That's tough. What piqued your interest in broadcasting?
I was addicted to the radio as a young boy. I remember the day World War II ended. We were hoeing cotton, and I'd gone to and any time I could sneak into the house by myself, I turned the radio on. I mean, I was just mesmerized by the fact that I could hear somebody talk from thousands of miles away. And they announced that Japan had surrendered. I run back down to the fields where some of the hoe hands were, and my mom and dad and 2 older brothers were hoeing cotton. And I said, the war's over, the war's over. I heard it on the radio. And of course, they didn't believe me until they ran up to the house and heard it themselves. But I always had an interest in it. In high school, I played football, ran track all 3 years. And the middle of my junior year, there was a rumor that there was going to be an opening at the local radio station there in Greenville, KGVL. I applied for the job and got it. So actually, I was on the air during my high school time from half of my junior year all the way through my senior year at the local radio station there in Greenville. After graduation, I was lucky enough to move over to a station in Sulphur Springs that was owned by a legendary broadcaster named Bill Bradford. And that's where I decided that I was going to be a broadcaster for the rest of my life. And I've been lucky enough to work under some of the smartest guys in broadcasting. here locally, like R.B. McAllister. In Houston, for the great Gordon McClendon, the man who invented Top 40 radio at KILT in Houston. So I've been fortunate enough to always take a job where I learned more and more and more at every stop. You know, they say you never learn anything good from a good job. You learn the do's and don'ts when you have a really bad job. But I can honestly say I never really had a bad job in radio because every station was different. Every management style was different. And I knew early on that one day I wanted to be in the owner's office. And through the years, my wife and I have made that possible.
Talk a little bit about your journey from Greenville to Sulphur Springs and ultimately to Lubbock.
Well, I didn't go to Lubbock first. I went to Plainview. I left Sulphur Springs to go to a little job at KTUE in Tulia. And it was interesting because it was a morning announcer job, an afternoon sales manager job. And I was still just 18 years old, but I wanted to learn all facets of broadcasting, because when you're a DJ, you come in, do your shift, you go home. You know nothing about the sales end or the engineering end of radio. And I just wanted to learn everything. And I knew if I could go to a small station and learn it from the ground up about how to approach clients, how to make sales presentations. And then from KTUE in Tulia, I ended up in Lubbock at KLBK Radio. It was an AM station. It's still in Lubbock. It's silent right now. It was on the AM dial at 1340. I was the program director there at KLBK. From there, I was offered a job at the McClendon station in Houston, KILT, which I readily accepted, but eventually ended back at Lubbock at KSEL, AM and FM. Side note, at KLBK Radio, I worked with a guy named Ray Moran, the current owner of this station's father, who was a great guy. Ray was
a great guy.
Funny, nothing condescending about him at all.
No.
He was always, it seemed like the joke was always on Ray, and which he loved it.
Specifically, what was it that brought you from a market like Houston?
I had worked as the news director at KSEL Radio under R.B. McAllister and Bill McAllister, his son, who later served as mayor of Lubbock. R.B. served as a state representative, but was a great legendary broadcaster. He seemed to always be able to put his finger on the pulse of the listener. Just a great broadcaster. Good guy. Funny guy. But I had worked for them. I was a office holder for United Press International in Texas and ran across some of the management of KILT in Houston at a Dallas convention. They offered me a job and I took it. Stayed in Houston, my wife and I and two young girls, living in a place called Sin Alley, where Bush 43 was living across the street. Couple of songwriters next door in these apartment houses. It was a fun place to live, but not necessarily for a young mother with two young girls. But then one day I got a call from Mr. McAllister, and he said, "We have been approved for a TV station in Lubbock. It's going to be Channel 28, and it's going to be KSEL TV, and would you come back and be our news director and our news anchor?" And that was in 1967. And I came back immediately because I loved what I was doing in Houston. I was on the air from 6 to midnight with a guy named Russ Knight, the Weird Beard, one of the top-rated disc jockey in Houston. It was a fun run. It was great, but it wasn't a place to raise a family. You
told me before we started this, you had a couple of really good radio stories, at least one of which was pretty humorous.
I've got several, but one of the greatest radio stories I've ever heard in my life, which I was not a witness to, but it's legendary among some really old broadcasters like myself. It involves two Lubbock broadcasters from years ago The first one, of course, was the founder of KSEL Radio and KSEL Television, which is now KMAC, R.B. McAllister. Mr. Mack was the chief operating officer, the president, the head hickety-poo of the whole operation at Channel 28. His son Bill was on the air with a guy named Lou D. and myself on a show called TTO, the This, That, and the Other. And for some reason, it was a very popular radio show. And I left off by saying I moved back to become something that I didn't want to be, which was a 6 o'clock and 10 o'clock news anchor. I loved television news. I just didn't want to be on camera. I didn't think it was the right fit at the time. But anyway, I just wanted to explain and set the stage for this story because Mac McAllister was such a funny guy. This story involves Mac McAllister and a man named Grady Franklin Maples when they decided to do something that had never been done in radio before, and that is broadcast live a wedding. Not exactly an ordinary wedding, but a nudist wedding. Now, imagine this.
I've never heard of such a thing, honestly.
I have heard of one in my entire life, and I'm old. And the story is this story about Mac and Grady Franklin Maples broadcasting this nudist wedding. Now, in order to cover this wedding, they too were nude. They had to take their clothes off like everybody else.
Okay, where was this? Pretty sure this wasn't in Lubbock.
No, I understand it was in Denver. So they start the broadcast, and they're picking their words carefully. And they're
Are they covering this for a broader audience than the Lubbock, Texas market?
I understand it was to be broadcast later. This was in the days before tape recording. It was in the days of wire recording, where you recorded on wire, which the quality was pretty good, really. So they were wire recording this nudist wedding, and they talked about how many people were there and the groom's family on one side and the bride's family on the other.
So are the guests expected to be nude as well?
Everybody in there was,
all right.
As my daddy used to say, buck naked, or more polite term, nude.
Yeah.
So they are describing these people. So in the small talk, Mr. McAllister starts describing the setting on the stage. And he describes how handsome the best man is, to which Grady Franklin Maples interrupts and says, well, Mac, I'm looking around, and best man is not the best man in the crowd. So what happened next was the best man, during the ceremony, he dropped the ring. And this part of the description of the wedding, I've just got to skip. But he did bend over and pick it up. So it comes time for the final vows. The bride and groom exchange vows, exchange their ring. The organ plays, and they go down the aisle and leave. So they're doing the wrap-up. Of course, you know, just two guys sitting there trying to wrap up the show. Thankfully, this is the end of this story that I'm telling. So Mr. Mack asked Grady Franklin Maples, he said, well, Grady, it was a great event. We broke ground. This never happened before in radio. They were all congratulating themselves. And Grady Franklin asked Mr. McAllister, he said, well, Mac, what made the greatest impression on you in this whole nudist wedding? Now, you have to think about Mac's answer. He said, Grady, I believe it was those cane-bottom chairs we were sitting in.
Okay.
I say, you got to think about it.
Let's do that.
Yeah.
Thanks for sharing that. That's definitely a unique moment in West Texas broadcasting history.
And the story was rampant in all broadcasting circles for half a century.
You know, you mentioned that in 1967, Mr. McAllister called you and said, hey, we're starting a new station. in those days, in the late 60s, early 70s, if you wanted your news or you wanted information about the outside world, you had the Lubbock Avalanche Journal, you had local radio, and you had local television. And you had print magazines for broader perspective. But you had significant influence on how the news was delivered. Talk about that responsibility and how you handled that.
I always thought that at the time, during the 1960s, the time of Walter Cronkite and all of the other broadcasters, I thought television news was the dullest thing I'd ever watched in my life. And prior to that, of course, KSEL radio at 950 was known for very aggressive news coverage. As a matter of fact, if you heard a siren in Lubbock and you turned on the radio, you were going to find out what it was within 30 or 40 seconds. We were very, very aggressive in covering the news. I said, we're going to bring radio news to television. We're going to be very aggressive. We're not going to protect anybody. During those days, if one of the community leaders got caught in a DWI, you never heard about it. Well, we changed all of that because of the way I was taught to do news when I was very, very young in the radio business. I learned it in the third news story I ever broadcast on a radio station. It was in Greenville, Texas, at KGVL. I was still in high school, and I would go in at 6 o'clock and read the 6 o'clock news, and then I was a disc jockey from 6:30 to midnight. Well, the third or fourth night I was on the air, I had a news story that was stacked third in the news, and it was about a DWI. A young man had been arrested for DWI and speeding, and it was my brother. And he was just out of the Marine Corps, kind of trying to find his place back in civilization, so to speak. And I read the story. It hurt. I didn't like it. But I realized then that the news is the news, and you can't discolor it for any reason whatsoever. And that philosophy's always stuck with me. I had some very famous run-ins as news director at Channel 28, with the athletic director at Texas Tech, with several mayors, several city council people, but everybody was treated equally. And I think that's what covering the news is about, Gordon. I spoke one time to a class at Texas Tech, and I asked the class if they were given instructions on how to do the news. 2 or 3 of the students spoke up and said, our instructor teaches us to do it with objectivity. And I said, your instructor is full of you-know-what. I said, There's no objectivity in the news business. I said, it's fairness. I said, I want to talk to some of you individually. And I asked a young lady who was seated on the front row. And I said, can I ask you a personal question? She said, yeah. I said, are you perhaps Catholic? And she said, yes, I am. I said, do you think you could write me an objective story about abortion? She said, no. I said, can you write me a fair story about abortion? She said, yes, I think so. I think I can. And oddly enough, I was never asked back. But there's so much, quote, of this fake aspect in our news coverage today that, to me, it's not right. All you can be is fair. If you've got a story that's got 2 points of view and you've got a minute to write it, it's 30 seconds on one point, 30 seconds on the other, and the listeners should always decide. Not the guy writing the news, not the guy reading the news. The listener should decide on what's objective and what's not.
Very good point. Paul, we talking about some of your early days at KSEL as the news director. Talk to us a little bit more about how that station evolved.
It was very, very helpful to my career. When I came back from Houston, the radio station, of course, was still on the air. The TV station was not quite on the air. It was in the construction stage. So basically, I started back to work as the news director on radio, and we had myself and 5 other people in that news department. And the first week that television was on the air, Gordon, we got our Friday paychecks. And so I get my pay envelope and I open it up, and there's 2 checks in it. It's got my regular radio salary, which was very generous in 1967. And then it had an identical check from television for the same amount. So we had a gentleman named Don Garth, who was our comptroller, so to speak. He ran the business office. So I go down to his office and I said, which one of these checks do you want back? I said, you made a mistake, gave me 2 checks, and which one do you want back? And he said, you'll have to talk to Mr. Mack about that. So I go down the hallway, talk to Mr. Mack. I said, Mr. Mack, Don Garth mistakenly wrote me 2 checks, and he didn't know which one to take back. And Mr. Mack said, are you going to be the radio news director? I said, Mr. Mack, I serve at your pleasure. He said, what about television? I said, Mr. Mack, I serve at your pleasure. He said, if you're going to do 2 jobs, you need to be paid for 2 jobs. So basically, the week that Channel 28 went on the air, the McAllister family doubled my salary. And they didn't increase it 20%, 25%. They doubled it. This may be uncomfortable. It's a little uncomfortable for me, but at the time, during my period at KSCL radio and television, I was making more money than the city manager of Lubbock, Texas. And I never thought I was worth it, number one. Number two, it just shows you how generous somebody can be when somebody really puts their heart and soul into what they did. Did I earn it? Yeah, I carried a mobile phone, I carried a walkie-talkie and a pager everywhere I went. When I was in the shower, they were on a dry towel right over there on the counter because we didn't miss anything. We just couldn't. And the coverage during the May 11th tornado was probably the pinnacle of news coverage at Channel 28.
Take us back to that day.
Of course, it was a terrible day. You know, we lost 26 people, Gordon. But the weather was so bad leading up to the actual tornado itself. We were lucky in the fact that we didn't lose 100 because a lot of people were out, young people were out early and riding in their cars, and it just kept raining. The water got curb deep, and everybody said, going home. So
tornado hit at 9:30, 10 o'clock?
About 8:40, about 8:36 is when it hit.
But if it had hit at 5:30, it'd been completely different.
My goodness.
Yeah.
And this was the days before Doppler radar. I mean, it just came on us out of the black, so to speak. But I had been down to the operations center at the Lubbock Police Department. And I had my wife with me and my 2 young girls with me because when the weather was really bad, I wanted them with me because I felt like I could protect them. Where if they were home, helter-skelter, who knows what. So we leave, and we are driving back to Channel 28 for me to start writing the lead stories for that night. And I get to the intersection of Avenue A and Broadway. And as I pull up to stop, the fire department radio comes alive and says, our roof is just caved in. 2 police officers say, we've been spun around out here by the tech campus. There's a tornado on the ground. And when they built Channel 28 and combined it in the KSCL radio news department and the TV news department, there was a switch in the master control room at Channel 28. You could throw that master switch, and whoever was on a mobile news unit was automatically broadcasting live over radio, AM, FM, and television. And I was talking to the newsroom, and I said, give me the red switch. And they threw it, and I just said, there's a tornado on the ground in Lubbock. Take cover. I drove about a half a block south and positioned myself under the railroad tracks there at that old overpass at about 13th and Avenue A. That way, my wife and I and my 2 girls, we were able to survive the tornado there under that overpass and got back to the station. And then, I went 71 hours without sleep. after May 11th. That night, I called a man in Slayton named Fred Evans, and Fred Evans had Evans Flying Service. He had the only helicopter in West Texas. He sprayed crops with it. I said, we've had a tornado in Lubbock, and it's bad. And I said, can you have your helicopter here at Channel 28 at 84th and Avenue L in the morning at first light? He said, I'll be there. And I said, bring plenty of fuel. And they landed just about first light. And we put the director of TV in the helicopter, a guy named A.C. Wimberly, who's still around, gave him a camera, told him to start shooting aerial coverage and bring the film back, and we'd have another camera loaded for him. We didn't have any water, so we couldn't process the film. So I called a man named C.W. Ratliff, the news director over at Channel 11, and they had a well, so they had water. I said, you guys develop the film, we pick it up, take it back to Channel 28, we show it on Channel 28, then we bring it back to you and you can show it next. Not first, but second. And we did that all day long. We shot 2,000 or 3,000 feet of film, aerial film of the damage of the May 11th tornado. And it was a harrowing experience.
Absolutely.
Changed the look of our city. And the mayor at the time of the tornado had been in office just days. His name was Jim Granberry. He was a dentist here at Lubbock. And we had a very young city council at that time, the youngest probably in our history, and forever changed the location of the Lubbock airport. It changed the face of our community. It changed Lubbock, unfortunately, because we lost so many, but changed it for the better.
Did it change anything about the way you viewed your role as a news director?
I made a terrific mistake just days before the May 11th tornado. Jim Granberry, the mayor, called me and he said, we have a vacancy on the Lubbock Housing Authority Board. And he said, would you please take it? And I said, no. I said, Jim, I'm news director. I don't serve on boards and committees and commissions. I said, that automatically taints me. And I said, believe me, I said, I screw up enough by myself. I don't need any extra help in making mistakes. He said, you're not even going to have to go to a meeting because the term expires like on May 30th. And this was like May the 4th or something.
Right.
He said, but we've applied for a grant. And he said, somebody resign. We don't have a quorum. He said, please do it. I said, okay, if I don't have to go to meetings, I'll do it. Well, right after the May 11th tornado, we had one area, the Guadalupe neighborhood, totally destroyed. And all of a sudden, all of that work fell on the Lubbock Housing Authority Board to try to relocate those families out of Guadalupe. And the only place was over in East Lubbock, in an area which had been primarily white-only housing, but the white flight had left a lot of vacant homes over there. It was a housing development called Cherry Point. And so in addition to trying to serve as news director, I was on the phone constantly with Lubbock Housing Authority trying to get folks that were displaced out of Guadalupe over to Cherry Point until their homes could be rebuilt in the Guadalupe neighborhood. It's a crazy time.
It was.
Nutty time.
Absolutely. Probably need to wrap up this episode, but if you have time, we're going to ask you to do a second part of this interview. I want to thank you for listening today. Please join us again next week for another episode of Archive West Texas.